So we should go for it. And the last point, of course, is always, where do we go from here? Those who are interested, what can you do to deepen your knowledge? And of course, which I cannot tell you now, we will, in another little lecture, we will give you the prizes of the 20 best students in this MOOC. It will be 1 ton of CO2 that we will send to you by mail. Okay, so let's start. The main messages of this MOOC, you will remember, climate change is man-made and ongoing. You see it in extreme events, you see it in other glaciers, for example, the melting of the ice caps of the globe and so forth. And this has health impacts, which we see already. Think of heat waves and so forth, and which will increase in an exponential way. That means it will be steeper and steeper, the impact to be felt. We'll have about 80 plus diseases which are impacted by climate in a negative way, both communicable and non-communicable ones. Our capacity and doctors' capacity to adapt and to protect the population is limited. And the health impacts, in the absence of a global agreement, while I record this, we are 2 weeks away from COP21. When you see this, you will have the results of COP21. So if they do not move and come to an agreement, then there will be serious health impacts, among many other impacts. And indeed, some parts of the globe will be uninhabitable because of heat and humans' limited capacity to adapt to heat. On the other hand, effective climate policies, hopefully done in 2 weeks, will reap enormous health co-benefit. And that's the good news. And the final point I wish to push in this last lecture is our main motive to do something about the climate is our health, and particularly the health of our children and grandchildren. So let's come to the second point, enjoying a climate-friendly, healthier world. You have here the globe and health on the top and climate, protected climate at the other end. And then we go around and you see a lot of things that link health with protection of the climate that are very positive, that are enjoyable. First one, equity. Public health people have known for millennia that inequity creates ill health. So if we make, and climate change will also increase inequities, as we have learned. So this is a common denominator. If we protect the climate, if we protect health, we will have a more equitable world. And that's a world maybe without as much violence and as much cleavages, social cleavages, as we've seen so far. Sustainability is a buzzword. It means that our current state and that the values and the things we want to protect will be protected also in the future. That's what we owe our children. And that's true for health, and that's true for the climate. Climate change is the perfect storm for sustainability. As Obama said, we are the first generation to feel the impacts of climate change and the last to be able to do something about it. So it's a turning point. It's a historical moment. Our generation has a responsibility. Development. In the presence of climate change, all these development gains that we've achieved as a global community in the last 50 years, inequitable as they may have been, will be decreasing, will be lost. So there's no health without development. And development impacts on the ability to cope with climate change, and climate change impacts negatively on development. We've seen that in previous lectures. Now, nature's beauty is another argument why people care about the climate, and that is linked too with green cities, more pleasant cities, which is for us also a way to recreate ourselves, to have leisure time, to have jogging, to have fun, to do some gardening maybe. So all this is linked together. And there are many interconnections which I cannot show you in detail now, but you can figure them out. So these things are not standing on its own, but they are all linked. And this is called planetary health. It's a new concept, maybe a new buzzword. And if you want to know more about it, go into our reading list. It's just published in The Lancet in July this year. But the main things, I will put them in the center again, are these children. Our children, that is what drives our action in terms of these long-term effects of climate change to protect their health. Now, the way forward. If you want to learn more, there's just a book that came out during that taking of all these films, and just last month by my good colleague and friend Jonathan Patz and Mr. Levy. It's called Climate Change and Public Health. And it covers in much more detail as this MOOC, in a very nice way, the topic. So if you want to learn more, buy this book and do some more digging deep in the substance matter. If you want to join those who do research, you know that we have, in many points that I showed you and my colleagues, the evidence was not so good. And health is worse in terms of evidence, grounding in evidence, than maybe agriculture and forestry. So we have to change this. So I would invite all those of you who have made it till the end of this MOOC to think about, can you contribute even in doing research? If you do so, if you want to do so, there are 2 courses that I know of. I stand to be corrected, and I'm happy to be corrected. Only 2 courses in this world that focus on study and research methods to look at the link between climate change and health. One is in Umeå University in northern Sweden, and one is in Heidelberg University. And we will add this as a track to our long-standing climate change and health course as of July next year, 2016. So either you read and dig a little bit deeper, or you do research, and then you will be one of the actors of producing evidence. You should act. Sitting back and say, I've done that MOOC, everything is fine now, is maybe a little bit aiming low. Make your and your family's choices, everyday choices, more climate friendly. You know that in richer parts of the world, more than 50% of emissions are controlled by people like me, people like my neighbors, people like my students, through their choices of consumption. In countries that are middle or low income, it's a little bit less, but you will also increase in those countries in consumption, and that will drive emissions. So don't only point to the big politicians, to industry, to transportation. It's us as well who need to act. But use the knowledge, that's the second point here, use the knowledge that you've gained in this MOOC to influence, to bring into the debate at your village, at your town council level, or at your national level, to bring in the health argument and the climate debate, climate policy debate. And lastly, let's stay in touch. Here's my email address. If you contact me, please write in the subject line MOOC, so that I know and can put you all in one big folder and answer your emails accordingly. So I thank you very much. It was great to have you with us. You were a lively class, interacting a lot, and let's stay in touch.
We go to project settings, and we're going to need this, this web API key that I'm copying here. Otherwise, our authentication will not work. So copy that. OK. So I think that's basically everything we need in the Firebase console. There's a ton more that you can do here, and we're going to cover that in some of the future episodes. But for now, we're pretty much ready to go with just the default setup. So the next thing I want to do is switch over to my command line. And I've already gone ahead and created a directory to hold my demo application. And Firebase also provides a really useful set of command line tools that you can install that'll go ahead and like scaffold a project for you. So if you don't have those installed already, you can do npm install -g firebase-tools. That'll go out, fetch all that stuff, set it up for you, so you'll now have a Firebase command. I've already got those installed, so you don't have to watch me do any of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run Firebase init. And it's going to put a very rad emoji on my screen. And it's going to ask me some questions about what sort of Firebase features I would like to have in this project. Firebase provides a real-time database, which is awesome, and we will be using that, so we'll leave that checked. And then we've got Firebase hosting, and that lets us basically just do hosting of static assets. We can host our entire site on Firebase if we want, so I will leave that in there as well. I'll hit enter. It's going to ask us what project we want to associate with. So since we just created that one called Polyfire, here I'll move this up a little bit. This is a little easier to see. So we will associate with Polyfire. What file should be associated with the database? We'll just use the default value there, database rules.json. What directory do we want to use? We'll say our public one. And then it's going to ask if Firebase should sort of configure its local server rules to direct everything to index.html. So if we were building like a single page web app, I'm going to say, yes, I would like that feature, because that's pretty cool. And at that point, it's basically done. And if we go ahead and we open this up in our code editor, we'll see that this has started to kind of scaffold some things out for us. So I've got these, like Firebase JSON, Firebase RC file that, points to my project name, stuff like that. This is all just configuration to make Firebase work. What we're mainly going to be working with today, though, is this public directory. So this is where our code is going to live. The other nice thing that we can do with the Firebase tools is we can start up a local dev server. So we'll say Firebase serve. And it's actually going to look at the rules that we have in our Firebase JSON there. That tells it to serve our public directory. So we can then just open up localhost 5000, and you'll see a page that looks like this, letting you know that your local instance of Firebase is working. Cool. All right. The next thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and install Polymer, and we want to install Polymer Fire, which is a set of Polymer elements that work specifically with Firebase. So because I want everything to live in this public directory, I'm actually going to create a bower.rc file. So I'll create a .bower.rc file, so .bower.rc. And I will use this to tell Bower to install all my stuff into that public dir. So I will say directory is public/Bower components. Cool. And then in my terminal, Bower init. Yeah, it'll ask us a bunch of questions about our project. We can just use the default values. That's fine. And then we will Bower install save. We definitely want Polymer/Polymer. We're going to want Firebase/Polymer Fire. And we're going to want Polymer elements/paper button. All right. So that's going to go out and fetch all of those resources and dump them into our public directory. Finished pretty quickly, which is good. And now we're basically ready to start building our app. And remember, the goal of this app is to basically have a sort of a simple sign-in flow for the user. So all I'm going to build today is a button that when you click on it, it'll sort of take you through the OAuth flow for Google sign-in. And when the user is actually signed in, it'll just like display their name on screen. That way we know we at least have something working there. So let's go into our index.html file. And there's a bunch of code here that Firebase sort of set up for us that I'm just going to go ahead and delete because I don't really need any of this stuff. So we'll get rid of that. We'll get rid of everything in the body. I'll make this a little bit bigger. We'll rename this Firebase auth or something like that. And because we're using Polymer, because we're building kind of a Polymer app, I'm going to start off by creating just like a my app element that can sort of like hold all of my logic. So I'll have a my app element here. I'm going to make sure to include an HTML import for that. So we're going to ask for myapp.html. OK. And inside of this myapp element, myapp.html, we're going to want to import some of the Polymer Fire elements. So let's go check those out really quick. So we'll go to beta.webcomponents.org. This is the new catalog where you can find all sorts of interesting custom elements. The ones that I am looking for are called Polymer Fire. So go check these out. So this is a suite of elements created by the Firebase team specifically for Polymer. And you can see here that basically what we want is this Firebase app element. And we're going to combine it with this Firebase auth element. So when I Bower installed these, I got both of these already. But you can sort of see the signature for how these work. Here, I'll bump this up a little bit so you can read that. So you create a Firebase app element. You basically tell it about your domain. You give it that API key that we copied earlier. And you create a Firebase auth element. And that'll tell you when your user is signed in or not. Right? So far, so good. So in our my app element over here, I basically want to create an element that's going to hold that Firebase app element. So I got some code here that I've already written, kind of stolen from another project. And let's go through and we'll update this a little bit. I can kind of explain what's happening. So I've got a DOM module from my app element. I've got this Firebase app element inside of here. And I want to give it the domain for my project. So if we go back to Firebase, we go back to the console, we look at our project settings. What it actually wants is this project ID right here. So it says Polymer Fire or Polyfire 11D42. So that's what we're going to use. So our auth domain is going to be Polyfire 11D42. Our database URL, even though we're not using it yet, we can go ahead and set that up. And then our API key is going to be that one that we copied. So get rid of that. And we'll drop in API key that we copied there. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to have this login element that I'm going to create. But essentially, this is all that my app is going to do for us. It's just going to set up the connection to Firebase app. And then it's going to have a little login element that will sort of like toggle on and off. So let's go ahead and create that. Create a my login HTML. So again, I've got a little bit of code that I'm just going to steal and drop in here just to start to scaffold out my login element. What I want to do is I want to make sure that I am importing the Firebase app elements. I'm going to steal this link tag here. I don't have any of my snippets now that I'm using Visual Studio Code. And it's making me like the world's slowest developer. So if anybody wants to create a Visual Studio Code snippets package for Polymer, I would totally be your best friend. But what we're going to do is we're going to import Bower components slash, is it Polymer Fire, I believe? Polymer Fire slash Firebase-auth. All right, so Polymer Fire slash Firebase-auth.html. And we're also going to pull in the paper button. All right, so we'll have paper button slash paper button.html. It's looking good. Inside of our template, I'm going to drop in a Firebase auth element. This is the basic signature for a Firebase auth element. I want to give it an ID because I am going to need to reference it in JavaScript a little bit. And then it's got a user property that we are going to expose to the outside world using this binding. So we're just going to have a thing called user. It's also got this value called status known, which could be interesting. It's a Boolean that tells you whether or not you can assert the presence of a user and whether or not you're allowed to sort of like check the user object. So I'm including it here. I'm actually not going to use it in my code today because I'll be 100% honest. I'm not entirely sure if I need to use it in my code, but I am including it here just so you know about it. Maybe in the next episode, we'll discover if it's actually useful or not. But I'm just going to drop it in there so it's on everyone's radar. And lastly, we have this provider value, which I'm just going to set to Google. Because if you remember, we went through and when we were in our dashboard, we set up the authentication method as sign in with Google. The next thing we need to do is we need to drop in some paper buttons. Here, I'll close the sidebar so you can see this a bit easier. So I got a paper button here. It's raised, so it'll have a bit of a drop shadow. And when the user taps it, it's going to run a login method. And I've got this little thing that I'm doing here where I'm hiding the button if there is a user present. So if the user is already signed in, let's not show the sign in button, right? And I've got basically the exact same thing going down here for this other button. This will be our log out button. And we just sort of flip the logic. So if there is already a user, then let's display the log out button. And if there is not a user, we'll display the log in button, right? Cool, so far so good. Let's also add a little bit of script here to define our element. So we'll say this element is a my login element. And for the properties, we basically will want to expose this user property. So let's say user. Let's see, which is an object. Let's see. We also want to have that status known property. So status known. And that is also going to be an object. OK. And now I want to implement these login and logout methods. So these should be pretty straightforward. We're basically just going to use some of the APIs that the Firebase auth element exposes for us. So I'm going to just go ahead and paste some code in here that I already copied. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the ID of the auth element. So remember, when we say this $, that's Polymer's way of saying reference this thing with this ID. So we'll say this $.auth sign in with popup. And that method basically tells the auth element to open the OAuth screen and ask someone to sign in using Google. For the logout method, it's basically just call sign out using that, right? The last thing that I want to do is I want to add just a little template here that will toggle on and off when we have a user or not. And it will display that user's name, just so we can verify that the user object we get back is correct. So I've got some code that I'm just going to paste in here. And yeah, so I'm using a DOM if. I'm checking if we have a user already. And then I've just got an h1 where I'm just going to bind to the user's display name. All right, so I think we're pretty close to having everything where we want it. Let's just double check all of our imports here. We don't want to have a white screen of death. That does happen from time to time. So everything in my login looks good. In my app, we need to make sure that we are importing my login. So let's do that. Let's go back up here. So we will pull in my login.html. We're also going to want to pull in that